Thank you for this invitation to return to your congregation. I believe this is the third time that I have visited you, and I always appreciate the opportunity. And I thank John for inviting me to speak on this wonderful subject of mystery and the unknown, because it's a fascinating subject that enfolds all of us to some degree. That is, if we are open to it. It is my hope today to view things mysterious and unknown through the lens of science. I must begin by defining what I mean by ambiguity, because it has multiple meanings in fields like linguistics, philosophy, mathematics, and ethics. What I mean by ambiguity is the uncertainty that we face on a daily basis. We spend much of our life trying to reduce the chaos of our existence, wanting to find answers to our angst, only to realize that we are unable to avoid the inevitable choices that we would rather not make. When I say that life is ambiguous, I am implying that life is not foreordained or predetermined. We have a choice to make as to whether we will live in denial of a reality we may not like, or simply to learn to live with it. I have grown up in a life of science. The role of science is to assist us in understanding the basis of our existence by revealing the intricacies of nature in all of its mysteries. Scientists are interested in how things work and can be explained under all manner of circumstances, what they are composed of, and how those physical properties affect or interact with other things. This would include the mysterious quantum mechanics that are often described in possible physical properties that are not yet actualized. Recalling Niels Bohr's famous quote about quantum theory points to the mysterious nature of the quantum. Anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it. Living a life within science has made me personally less anxious about ambiguous or unknown things that I encounter outside of science. Consciousness, or how the mind is aware of itself and its surroundings, is one of the most perplexing and mysterious aspects of sentient life. Neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran, on unlocking the secrets of consciousness and behavioral neurology, frames the dilemma when he says, "The brain is a 1.5 kilogram mass of jelly, the consistency of tofu. You can hold it in the palm of your hand, yet it can contemplate the vastness of space and time, the meaning of infinity, and the meaning of existence. It can ask questions about who I am, where do I come from, questions about love and beauty, aesthetics and art, and all these questions arising from this lump of jelly. It is truly the greatest of mysteries," he says. A leading figure in the field of consciousness studies, Terence Deacon, a professor of biological anthropology and neuroscience at the University of California, Berkeley, in the opening of his book titled Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter, looks at mystery from another angle. He says, "Science has advanced to the point where we can precisely arrange individual atoms on a metal surface, or identify people's DNA contained in their hair. And yet," he says, "ironically, we lack a scientific understanding of how sentences in a book refer to atoms, DNA, or anything at all." He goes on to say, "The purpose of my writing this book is to share something that isn't embodied by any of these physical processes and objects, ideas. And curiously, it is because these ideas lack these physical attributes that they can be shared with tens of thousands of readers without ever being depleted. Even more enigmatically, ascertaining the value of this enterprise is nearly impossible to link with any specific physical consequence. It is something almost entirely virtual. Maybe nothing more than making certain ideas easier to conceive, or, if my suspicions prove correct, increasing one's sense of belonging in the universe. Deacon goes on to say that many of these virtual phenomena, a function, a reference, a purpose, or a value, is in some ways incomplete. There is something not there. Without this something missing, they would just be plain and simple physical objects or events, lacking these otherwise curious attributes. Longing, desire, passion, appetite, mourning, loss, aspiration, are all based on analogous intrinsic incompleteness and integral withoutness. Deacon, while himself as a scientist, is critical of the strict materialistic interpretation of science, because he says it does not include aspects of this missing dimension that he calls an essential absence. He said, what is absent matters, and yet our current understanding of the physical universe suggests that it should not. A causal role for absence seems to be absent from the natural sciences. So Deacon is inviting us to acknowledge aspects of consciousness that are often overlooked or assumed without definition. Ever since the onset of the Enlightenment, there has been a shift from the religious description of the natural origin of phenomena to a more definitive scientific explanation of things. As a result, a polarization has developed between religion and science, where anything supernatural was viewed as bankrupt because it relied on the imagination and could not adequately be described scientifically. This viewpoint is still prevalent in the ethos of science. Yet, what is acknowledged is that scientists rely on imaginative thinking when they hypothesize prior to testing and experimenting. Without imagination, science as we know it would not exist, because everything builds on previous knowledge, and future experiments are based initially on imagined, hypothesized outcomes. The Enlightenment view of science contributed to the denigration of imagination to fictitious creations of the mind, as practiced by artists, writers, and poets, God forbid. However, physicist Jean-Marc Lévy-Leblond seeks to correct this misnomer in saying, the physicist, as does the novelist, invents worlds and tells stories. The scientist is an unrepentant dreamer. Far from sticking to actual factual observations, he must imagine fictitious situations in the form of hypotheses, which may, from time to time, prove veracious. Scientists deal with facts, but they wouldn't get anywhere without dreaming up stories first. Part of becoming a scientist, in my estimation, is to become inoculated against a fear of the unknown or failure. To succeed in science, at least from my experience, is to realize that one is constantly dealing with ambiguity or the unknown. Of course, we start where others have left off, but ask questions about what we do not yet know and proceed to test whether our hunch is correct or not. Many times we do not succeed. If one is easily daunted or has a fear of failure, science is not the profession to pursue. However, it is the hallmark of a good scientist to examine the question from another angle, providing that the problem is still worth continued examination. It seems that people who have not been initiated in ways of thinking with some modicum of science are uncomfortable with the unknown because they prefer black and white answers to their questions and have no interest in struggling over finding answers to their dilemma by trial and error. This can unfortunately lead to a form of dependence upon others who are more than happy to accommodate them and lead them down their path of certainty. In addition, religions have also been stereotyped as purveyors of this kind of certainty to the point of encouraging dependency. I would concur that many religions rely on this kind of dependency or belief from their followers because their whole theology is based on blind faith in a supernatural being that is in absolute control of everything. As a result, adherents become supplicants, or some might even say victims of a capricious God. The mythological nature of this God of power and might seems to prevail in the minds of both believers and non-believers. It is ironic that theologians have for centuries posited that God is beyond description in human language. Because of this mystery, the only way to speak of God is in metaphor, for no one, to my knowledge, has ever seen God. How is it that when the word God is mentioned, everyone conjures up an image based on some previous experience or exposure gleaned from our past? Therefore, if God is part of your lexicon, and you choose to have a conversation about God, what metaphor or metaphors do you choose? I recently had an interesting exchange with someone who read an article in the Arizona Daily Star about a talk I would be giving. He accused me of exhibiting a need for God. I appreciated the invitation to respond, and I told him that I personally had no need for God. I told him that I simply lived with God, and that I acknowledge cannot be explained or described. As a scientist, I also went on to explain that I did not believe that God was the creator of the universe, nor did God privilege life on planet Earth. As scientists, we probe mysteries of the origin of the universe that we call the Big Bang, and we are able to say really very little with any certainty surrounding that event. We can, however, point to the total inability of contemporary physics to provide any adequate description of the beginning, of that beginning, because of the incredibly high heat, pressure, and density that existed. Further, it is now thought that the Big Bang was likely a quantum event with no particular directionality, only statistical probability. To complicate matters further, an infinite number of universes may have emanated from this event. We happen to be riding on a universe that has physical constants that allow for continued, more rapid expansion. Since everything in the universe came from this singularity in space-time, we can state with some confidence that everything in the universe shares an interconnectedness that defies adequate description. Because of these proposals as to how the universe came into existence, we are unable to state with any certainty that any external agent played a role. Biological evolution is equally perplexing in adequately describing how life emerged from a prebiotic chemical soup. It is unlikely that we will ever know how those first life forms came into existence and how error-prone replication led to the perpetuation and evolution of life. The word that I feel best describes evolution is serendipity. And I would define that by as the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. The major segue into openly dealing with this previously unknown process of evolution was Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. The implication of this theory is that life evolved in a serendipitous manner, without any external influence other than the environment in which the organism existed. Although Darwin never formally stated this himself, interpreters of his theory of evolution related that God played no role. Significant to this understanding of evolution is that there was no plan for life, nor, for that matter, any intended outcome, or teleos, that would result in humans as the pinnacle of the evolutionary tree. To acknowledge this amazing thought is to enter into the mystery and ambiguity of life, because we will never know how life actually began. The beautiful part of this mystery is that evolution points to an interrelatedness of everything that has ever survived to reproduce. Richard Dawkins, in his book River Out of Eden, describes in brutal frankness the harshness of evolution and how certain wasps lay their eggs under the skin of unsuspecting caterpillars, and when hatched, the larvae consume the caterpillars from within. Dawkins says if nature were kind, she would at least make the minor concession of anesthetizing caterpillars before they are eaten alive from within. Instead, he says that nature is neither kind nor unkind. She is neither against suffering nor for it. Nature is not interested one way or the other in suffering unless it affects, in his estimation, the survival of DNA. The universe we observe, he says, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing, he says, but blind, pitiless indifference. Dawkins goes on to use these observations as evidence that there can be no God involved in privileging life. And that for him is sufficient to claim that there is no God at all. How Dawkins can exude such certainty is rather amazing because, as I mentioned earlier, even theologians have no proof for the existence of God. We scientists openly deal with the mystery of how the universe came into existence and how life came about. About all we can acknowledge is that body parts evolved to serve useful functions that were not intended because we have not been purposefully designed. Functionality exists because it has usefulness to living organisms to achieve a modicum of evolutionary progress through successful reproduction. For example, Terence Deacon points out that fingers did not evolve for the purpose of linguistic communication. However, he says, the moment that I began to use them to type words on a keyboard, they came to function for this end. Today, where would we be without appendages to type, text, and also use language in our newly discovered ways to communicate with our hands? Since the advent of consciousness, how the brain functions to plan, anticipate, and react on the basis of prior experience, we humans have suffered under the anxiety of the existential questions. Where did I come from? How did I get here? And where am I going? To placate ourselves, we created myths and stories intended to reduce this anxiety. However, when we did this, we put all of our hopes and fears into an idol that we called God, and for centuries placed ourselves in positions of dependency on this God of power and might. To be honest, we only have provisional answers to these existential questions, other than to realize that we all came from the same point in space-time. Entering into this introspection is a growth experience if one is open to embracing the ambiguity of how we got to this point in evolution. It can liberate us from the notion of a God in absolute control, where we humans have no recourse other than to accept our fate. However, all of this discussion about God does not provide any proof either for or against the existence of God. It has been enlightening for me to view religion and theology through the lens of science. Humans and all living organisms, for that matter, are trapped in a universe, in a world, in a body, in a cell that is not of our own making. The very idea that life as we know it even exists defies adequate explanation because the natural thermodynamic tendency is towards maximum dissipation or entropy. To counter this, all living organisms need energy to survive. How we cope with this natural ambiguity is very telling, because in order to survive, we need to learn how to deal with the unknown or the unexpected as individuals, finding sustenance along the way as well. As humans, we need to know and understand that we are not alone, as there are many others who are equally perplexed with the mystery of life. There is much that we do not know and may never fully understand. However, I personally find this exciting and challenging. Within the magnitude of the universe, the age of the earth, and the emergence of life, our lives are insignificant on a large scale. And yet, we realize that we too are capable of making a difference in this small microcosm of the universe. Biological scientists, in their curiosity, are prone to tinker with model organisms by taking them apart and to purify individual proteins and enzymes to understand how they function. This is also true of DNA, the template from which all proteins are encoded. This reductionist approach is useful only to a point, because examining the function of a single protein, enzyme, or gene in a test tube has little or no reality as to how that molecule functions in the environment of the cell. The cell is therefore a microcosm or an ecosystem that can function appropriately only when it is intact. In addition, cells have formed tissues and organs which have a greater capacity to function for the overall benefit of the organism in its ability to cope with the larger ecosystem in order to survive. In conclusion, we humans have evolved to this point without the benefit of a designer. This is a sobering understanding, because it points to our ultimate responsibility to others and ourselves. We cannot rely on, nor can we blame, anything or anyone else to assume what we ourselves must do in our collective coexistence. In our sentient existence, we are still left to cope with the unknown and unanticipated events that will happen to all of us. Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend John E. Gibbons, summed up the challenges of life when he spoke in a 1996 sermon. He says, living is confusing, ambiguous, and uncertain. Our jobs, our health, our families, our relationships are all unpredictable, and we're not just confused by other people, but we surprise ourselves by our own emotions and reactions. We say, I never expected this. I couldn't believe I just said that. I looked into the mirror and was shocked to see my father or my mother. I just don't know what to do. Gibbons counsels. He said, don't cover up, don't trivialize, don't escape. face it. There are no certainties in life, he says, no guarantees, no assurances, and there aren't going to be any. So we'd better welcome ambiguity. Not just tolerate it, but welcome it. Ambiguity is the greatest opportunity that we have in our lifetime. If you don't know you are lost, you can't find yourself. We can live with ambiguity if we welcome it. All I can add personally to these sage words is my own learning about dealing with ambiguity. And that for me is to put away all expectations. When I have had expectations, they have frequently been dashed by a different or unexpected outcome. I've come to the same conclusion as suggested by Reverend Gibbons, and that is to simply deal with whatever happens and accept that I have no control over what I am presented with in life experiences. Thank you.